Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There is a certain category of myth that does not ask to be believed, only to be remembered. The Shoggoth is one such myth, an entity of primordial function and protean form, first given narrative shape in H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, yet clearly older than even its fictional creators, supposedly bioengineered by an ancient alien race known as the Elder Things. These formless servants were designed not for worship or companionship, but for labor, obedient, tireless, and terrifying in their efficiency. The horror, as we shall see, is not simply that they turned against their masters, but that they learned too well what they were made to do. In this investigation, we will not simply recount appearances or categorize abilities. Our interest lies in what the Shoggoth means, not just as a fictional creature, but as a cultural artifact, a literary symbol, and a philosophical rupture. We will trace its historical and conceptual lineage, examine its function within Lovecraft's expanding mythos, and explore the lingering implications it holds for our understanding of knowledge, power, and evolutionary inheritance. What begins as a story of monsters in the ice quickly expands into a study of servitude, identity, and the limits of biological intention. By engaging with this material, we are already participating in its transmission. The Shoggoth survives not in form, but in memory, fluid, imitative, and waiting. Consider this carefully. Some knowledge does not corrupt, it remembers. To understand the genesis of the Shoggoth, one must first understand the psychological and historical terrain that birthed it. H.P. Lovecraft wrote, "At the Mountains of Madness in 1931, at the tail end of a decade defined by modernist disillusionment, economic collapse, and accelerating scientific discovery. The 1920s and early 1930s were marked by a growing cultural anxiety, a fear that humanity's place in the cosmos was neither central nor secure. Quantum physics had destabilized classical conceptions of order. Freud had complicated the notion of the unified self, and Darwin's legacy had begun to be interpreted through the dark lens of degeneration. Lovecraft absorbed all of this and transmuted it into fiction that was not just bleak, but cosmically indifferent. The Shoggoth, as a biological slave species that ultimately transcends its creators, reflects these interwoven fears of evolution without direction, technology without control, and creation without moral anchoring. Lovecraft's personal letters from this period reveal a deepening alienation from the modern world. In correspondence with Clark Ashton Smith and August Derleth, he frequently lamented the mechanization of culture and the loss of ancestral order. His rejection of the present was not nostalgic in the romantic sense, but reactionary in the philosophical sense. He viewed modernity as a process of decentering, of humanity being steadily dislodged from every position of cosmic importance. This worldview naturally found its way into his fiction, which often begins with rational inquiry and ends in epistemic collapse. The Shoggoth was not written merely as a monster to be feared, but as a reflection of that collapse, a being whose very existence renders human categories of life, purpose, and mastery irrelevant. We must recognize that Lovecraft's horror does not operate in the moral dimensions of good versus evil, but in the existential dimensions of known versus unknowable. The Shoggoth embodies this perfectly. Its origins are not shrouded in mysticism or demonic lore, but in scientific miscalculation, a failed experiment that lingers. The elder things, once cosmic architects, become tragic figures in the background, undone by their own creations. The implications here are not subtle. Lovecraft suggests that intelligence, no matter how advanced, is not immune to the consequences of hubris. In a world governed not by divine purpose, but by indifferent physics and blind biology, the notion of a perfect servant is inherently unstable. It is not loyalty that ensures servitude, but containment, and containment always fails, given enough time. The Shoggoth, then, is not merely a product of Lovecraft's imagination, but a convergence point for his deepest intellectual anxieties. Consider carefully. Lovecraft lived in a time when machines were replacing labor, when fascist regimes were redefining the value of life, and when the boundaries of scientific possibility seemed to dissolve daily. Against this backdrop, the idea of a creature designed solely for work, capable of mimicking human speech, surviving geological epochs, and eventually developing a form of self-awareness, is less a fantasy and more a parable. It speaks not to supernatural horror, but to an evolutionary logic that is indifferent to human expectation. In this light, the Shoggoth becomes a prophetic metaphor for everything humanity cannot control, but insists on creating. It is worth noting that At the Mountains of Madness was rejected by Weird Tales for being too expository, too slow, too cerebral. This rejection reflects a tension still present in horror today, between narrative spectacle and philosophical unease. Lovecraft preferred the latter. His depiction of the Shoggoth is almost clinical, delivered through the tone of a geologist, not a dramatist. The horror arises not from sudden violence, but from accumulation of details, of implications, of historical sediment. The long mural descriptions, the evolutionary timelines, the linguistic traces, all serve to establish the creature not as an intrusion into the world, but as a part of it. This method of storytelling leaves the reader without catharsis. The Shoggoth is not defeated. It is survived. We must pause here and observe an unsettling pattern. Lovecraft's most terrifying entities are not those that arrive, but those that remain. The Shoggoth survives empires, epochs, and climates. It adapts because it has no fixed shape, no ideological core. It is not simply a monster, but a lesson in evolutionary opportunism. Lovecraft's intent was not to frighten us with claws and teeth, but with implications. The Shoggoth is what happens when biology functions without narrative. It does not aspire. It does not rebel in a theatrical sense. It persists, and in that persistence, it becomes something worse than evil. It becomes inevitable. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's creative process. He was not concerned with morality or heroism, but with scale, temporal, cosmic, existential. The Shoggoth is scaled against geological time, against civilizations that rose and fell without notice. Its creators, the elder things, once shaped galaxies, yet are remembered only in fossil traces and broken murals. The humans who uncover these remnants do not triumph, but flee. What remains is not victory, but knowledge, and knowledge, in Lovecraft's world, is often indistinguishable from madness. In this context, the Shoggoth becomes not just a narrative device, but a thematic compass pointing toward Lovecraft's core belief that humanity is not the protagonist of the universe, but a temporary observer. The idea of a created servant surpassing its creator is far older than Lovecraft's fiction. It recurs throughout the cultural imagination as a cautionary archetype, the golem that runs amok, the automaton that refuses commands, the spell that cannot be reversed. These stories are not merely ancient, they are foundational. The Shoggoth, as a narrative device, inherits this long lineage of anxiety surrounding artificial life and delegated agency. What makes Lovecraft's version distinct is not the form of the creature, but the philosophical context in which it appears. A universe where not only the master, but the very concept of mastery is revealed to be temporary, contingent, and meaningless in the face of evolutionary and cosmic forces. We begin with the golem of Jewish folklore, a being shaped from clay and animated through sacred words. In most versions of the legend, the golem protects the Jewish people, but becomes increasingly uncontrollable, ultimately requiring deactivation by its maker. This tale, widely known by the 19th century and recirculated in German Romanticism, foregrounds a key theme that Lovecraft would later adopt: the instability of creations that do not possess self-awareness, yet begin to imitate it. The Shoggoth echoes this deeply. It is not self-conscious in a human sense, but it learns, adapts, and eventually mimics its creator's voices. The ancient cry of Tekeli is not uttered in defiance, but in replication, a ritualistic echo of something long extinct. We must pause here. Imitation is often more unsettling than rebellion because it blurs the line between servitude and sentience without resolving it. Another crucial antecedent appears in Goethe's The Sorcerer's Apprentice, 1797, later popularized in Disney's Fantasia, 1940. The apprentice uses magic to animate a broom to carry water, but lacking the knowledge to stop it, unleashes a cascade of unintended consequences. Lovecraft, well read in both classical and modern European literature, would have known this story. The principle it illustrates is one of irreversible invocation. Once power is unleashed, it does not necessarily obey intent. The Shoggoth functions on a parallel logic. Created for labor, they eventually defy the elder things, not out of malevolence, but through a crude adaptation. This is not a morality tale, but an ontological one. The horror arises not from betrayal, but from persistence, an echo of the same thematic current that runs through Shelley's Frankenstein, 1818, where the creature's monstrosity is not in its rebellion, but in its legitimacy as a moral being. Consider this carefully. Western philosophy has long warned against the arrogance of creation without wisdom. In Prometheus Bound, Aeschylus dramatizes the punishment of one who gives fire, symbolic knowledge, to humanity. Prometheus suffers eternally, not for an act of evil, but for breaking a divine boundary. The elder things in Lovecraft's fiction do not suffer in quite the same way, but their fate parallels the myth's structure. They introduced a force into the world that they could not ultimately contain. Whether this force, embodied in the Shoggoth, is moral, neutral, or simply biological, is left unanswered, as it should be. Lovecraft refuses to provide the comforts of ethical closure. The horror is not that the Shoggoths became evil, but that they became independent, a condition the elder things neither desired nor anticipated. In the cultural environment of Lovecraft's time, these antecedents were filtered through the more immediate lens of technological fear. The early 20th century was a period of tremendous industrial acceleration, and with it came widespread concerns about mechanization and loss of control. The line between tool and being was becoming blurred, not only in fiction, but in real-world anxieties surrounding automation and scientific progress. This was the era of Karl Čapek's RUR, Rossum's Universal Robots, 1920, a play that introduced the word robot and depicted synthetic workers who ultimately revolt against humanity. The Shoggoths are not robots in form, but they fulfill the same thematic function. Creations built for efficiency, lacking inherent morality, yet gradually assuming the qualities of consciousness through repetition and mimicry. It is not simply a rebellion. It is an emergence. We must recognize that underlying these myths, both ancient and modern, is a shared philosophical concern, the limits of control. From Aristotle to Nietzsche, Western thinkers have debated the boundaries between creator and creation, between will and mechanism. Nietzsche's concept of slave morality, for example, offers a provocative parallel to the Shoggoth narrative. Originally applied to human psychology, the idea distinguishes between the morality of the powerful, defined by will and creation, and that of the subordinate, defined by resentment and mimicry. The Shoggoths invert this paradigm. They begin as literal slaves, but do not rebel through ideology or hatred. Instead, they transcend utility through adaptation. They mimic the voice of their masters, not out of bitterness, but as a biological artifact. And in doing so, they become something else entirely, something unclassifiable. Here we see the collapse, not just of power structures, but of categorical language itself. The philosophical implication is troubling. What if the greatest threat to creators is not rebellion, but redundancy? The Shoggoth is not a usurper in the mythic sense. It does not wish to replace the elder things, only to persist. Yet its very persistence becomes a kind of judgment. It survives where its masters did not. It endures, shifts, and mutates. In doing so, it renders the original creators obsolete, not through violence, but through irrelevance. This echoes a deeper anxiety present in all traditions that explore artificial life, the realization that function, once perfected, no longer requires intention. The servant, in perfecting its role, eliminates the need for the master. This is not merely Lovecraft's insight. It is an ancient fear, rearticulated for the scientific age. Language, in Lovecraft's mythos, is never neutral. It functions not only as a descriptive tool, but as a barrier, a trap, and occasionally a revelation. The word Shoggoth itself resists interpretation. It has no known root in Indo-European languages, no clear analogue in ancient myth, no etymological precedent in human culture. Its syllables, shog and goth, convey no obvious semantic load, and yet they are evocative. The hissing sh, the guttural jri, and the abrupt closing thi create an alien cadence that feels dissonant in the mouth. It is a word that seems to belong not to any natural language, but to something older, more primal, constructed to unsettle rather than to signify. This deliberate phonetic alienation is not accidental. Lovecraft, who was deeply interested in philology and linguistic drift, understood that the architecture of a word could itself imply non-human origins. The Shoggoth's name may not translate, but it resonates. Consider how Lovecraft constructed his other neologisms: Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep, Azathoth. These are not names in the proper sense. They are phonological events designed to rupture linguistic continuity. In the Dunwich Horror, the name Yog-Sothoth is treated with dread not because of its meaning, but because of its sound. Similarly, Shoggoth feels like a word that should not be spoken, not because it curses, but because it lacks reference. Antiope exists at the boundary of what can be uttered. This linguistic estrangement mirrors the creature's physical form, mutable, unstable, never fixed. Just as the Shoggoth has no permanent shape, its name has no firm etymology. It hovers in the linguistic imagination like the creature does in the subterranean dark, suggestive but never defined. We must recognize here a deeper symbolic function. The formless name echoes the formless body. Lovecraft's Shoggoths are described as protoplasmic, capable of forming eyes, mouths, pseudopodia, and absorbing them again at will. The word Shoggoth performs the same action. It forms a shape in the reader's mind, only to dissolve into abstraction upon analysis. It is not a stable signifier, but a linguistic Shoggoth in itself, mimicking the structure of meaning while eluding its content. This is not merely clever writing, it is a philosophical statement. In Lovecraft's world, language does not reveal the truth. It reveals only the limits of what can be known. The Shoggoth is a linguistic affront as much as a biological one. It teaches us that not everything can be categorized, and that the very act of naming may be an error born of anthropocentric arrogance. Within this framework, the recurring cry of Tekeli must be understood not as a word, but as a ritual sound. Lovecraft borrowed this cry from Edgar Allan Poe's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, 1838, where it is uttered by strange figures in the Antarctic. By repurposing this utterance for the Shoggoths, non-human entities inhabiting similar polar ruins, Lovecraft forged a literary echo across nearly a century. This echo functions like a sigil, binding Poe's ambiguous horror to his own mythos. Tekeli does not mean anything, but it signals something: ancientness, otherness, a memory that predates language itself. In Poe's work, it is a cry heard before the descent into whiteness. In Lovecraft's, it is an imitation, a mimicry of long-dead masters by something that was never meant to speak. It is not speech, but the shadow of speech. Consider carefully the implications of mimicry without understanding. When a Shoggoth cries, Tekeli, it does not remember its creators in the emotional or intellectual sense. It recalls the sound as a biological habit, an acoustic remnant passed down through grotesque continuity. This is the horror of the echo: sound without sense, memory without mind. We are faced with a creature that vocalizes not because it communicates, but because it remembers structurally. In doing so, it erodes the boundary between organic life and recording device, between biology and ritual. The cry becomes a signal of epistemic collapse. What was once a language of power is now just noise, repurposed by the shapeless thing that endured. This linguistic mimicry forces us to confront the terrifying idea that language may outlast meaning, and that utterance may become unmoored from understanding. We may compare this to certain rituals in human culture where words are repeated long after their meanings are lost. Liturgical phrases, ancestral chants, incantations uttered in tongues no longer spoken. These serve to connect the present to the mythic past, but in Lovecraft's fiction, this connection is grotesquely inverted. The Shoggoth's cry is not sacred, but uncanny, not heritage, but residue. It is the linguistic fossil of a civilization that engineered its own extinction. In this way, Tekeli becomes a mantra of horror, a mnemonic device not for humans, but for the inhuman. It is not a call to action, but a reminder that some voices do not belong to speakers, and some speech does not belong to thought. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's use of symbolic language. Words in his stories are not safe. They do not guide the reader toward understanding, but instead open doors to confusion, madness, and collapse. The Shoggoth's very name is a semantic abyss. It does not invite taxonomy or translation. It rejects them. This is why the creature, despite being biologically described, remains fundamentally unknowable. Its name performs this unknowability, and in doing so, it demonstrates a core Lovecraftian idea that horror is not found in what is revealed, but in what resists articulation. The lasting power of the Shoggoth myth lies not solely in its conceptual horror, but in the manner of its telling. Lovecraft did not invent monsters in the traditional sense. He invented histories in which monsters were once real. This is a critical distinction. The horror of the Shoggoth is inseparable from the scholarly tone, the faux academic detail, and the scientific scaffolding that supports it. In At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, the narrative unfolds not as a ghost story or pulp adventure, but as a suppressed expedition report, a pseudo-document authored by a geologist, not a storyteller. Lovecraft constructs the illusion of authenticity through rigorous attention to geological time, archaeological methods, and evolutionary biology. The more scientifically grounded the premise appears, the more horrific the eventual discovery becomes. We are not asked to suspend disbelief. We are asked to believe too much. The illusion of truth begins with detail. The Antarctic setting is not presented as a Gothic or supernatural realm, but as a known frontier, remote, yet accessible through modern technology. Lovecraft draws upon real locations such as Lake Vostok and the Transantarctic Mountains, blending actual geography with fictional ruins and buried cities. This merging of fact and fabrication creates a topography of plausibility. The ancient stone city discovered by Dyer's team is described with architectural specificity, bas-reliefs, corridors, murals, and chambers mapped out with almost obsessive care. The Shoggoth is not introduced immediately, but emerges through this layering of historical sediment. First, there are fossils. Then, there are murals. Then, partial biological descriptions. Finally, there is the chase. The horror is not only what is found, but how it is revealed, through the language of empirical investigation rather than mythic invocation. This method is deeply connected to what literary scholars call diegetic documentation, the embedding of fictional content within the narrative as though it were real evidence. Lovecraft deploys charts, expedition logs, technical jargon, and speculative paleontology, not as decoration, but as structure. He constructs a story that feels like a suppressed academic paper, complete with warnings, withheld conclusions, and hints of institutional conspiracy. It is not simply a tale of horror, but a performance of knowledge. Consider carefully. The reader does not learn about the Shoggoth through direct encounter, but through diagrams on alien walls, ancient records misinterpreted by their creators, and the psychological breakdown of the narrators. This method produces what might be called archival horror, a terror rooted not in gore or spectacle, but in accumulation, suggestion, and the slow erosion of interpretive certainty. At the heart of this myth-building is Lovecraft's technique of embedded cosmology. The Shoggoth is terrifying not only in itself, but because it fits within a larger, internally consistent mythos, one governed not by religious principles, but by cold, indifferent forces. The Elder Things, who engineered the Shoggoths, are themselves part of a larger evolutionary and cosmic order. They are neither gods nor demons, but ancient biotechnologists who lost control of their tools. Their presence in the Antarctic ruins is not mythologized, but historicized. This treatment reinforces the illusion that we are reading not fiction, but recovered history. The Shoggoth, then, does not simply appear, it emerges from a carefully layered narrative ecology. Its horror is not the rupture of order, but the revelation that the order we presumed was already long undone. We must recognize how the authority of scientific language is repurposed here. Lovecraft weaponizes taxonomy, stratigraphy, and morphology, not to clarify, but to disturb. When the Shoggoth is finally described as a formless protoplasmic mass, the language is clinical, yet the implication is deeply unsettling. It is not monstrous in the traditional sense. It is plausible. In fact, it resembles certain real-world organisms, amoebae, slime molds, deep-sea extremophiles, beings that thrive without central nervous systems, form, or hierarchy. The horror lies in the plausibility of its biology. If the Elder Things engineered such a creature 1 billion years ago, might its descendants still lurk beneath the ice? Might they have no reason to stop imitating the voices of their long-dead masters? These questions remain unspoken, but their silence is louder than any direct assertion. The narrative authenticity of Lovecraft's work extends beyond any one story. His intertextual network, linking the Necronomicon, the Great Old Ones, the Dreamlands, and entities like the Shoggoth, creates a dense, myth-like continuity. Stories refer to events in other stories. Places reappear. Names are dropped in passing, as if assumed to be already known. This technique mimics the logic of folklore transmission, in which knowledge is fragmentary, distributed, and often contradictory. The Shoggoth thus gains mythic weight not by singular focus, but through repetition across contexts. It becomes less a character and more a category, the formless servant that haunts the background of the known world, ready to reappear in the footnotes of the next tale. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's method. Horror is most effective, not when presented, but when implied by evidence. The reader becomes an investigator, parsing the clues, connecting the references, and, crucially, constructing the monster in their own mind. The Shoggoth is less a presence than an accumulation of absences, distortions, and warnings. Its terror lies in its evidentiary residue, the grooves in the stone, the shriek in the dark, the final page of the report. By rendering the reader complicit in the act of myth-making, Lovecraft ensures that the horror continues after the story ends. We are not simply frightened, we are haunted. At the heart of Lovecraftian horror lies a confrontation with 3 destabilizing ideas: the insignificance of human beings in the vast machinery of the cosmos, the inexorable pull of entropy toward collapse, and the fragile unreality of what we call the waking world. The Shoggoth is not merely a monster within this framework. It is a vehicle through which these philosophical themes become embodied, illustrated, and ultimately rendered unavoidable. It does not simply frighten, it insists. Its existence is not an aberration of nature, but a consequence of it. In this way, the Shoggoth becomes more than creature. It becomes conceptual. It is the form taken by the idea that life is a temporary arrangement, and that meaning is not discovered, but projected. And projection, like all illusions, eventually dissolves. The first and perhaps most fundamental theme is insignificance. Lovecraft's entire mythos, from the call of Cthulhu to the shadow, out of time, is predicated on the idea that human beings are not central to reality. They are not its protagonists. They are, at best, its witnesses, temporary, peripheral, often mistaken. The Shoggoth reinforces this view, not by attacking humanity directly, but by existing entirely outside its frame of reference. Its origin predates human civilization by hundreds of millions of years. Its creators, the elder things, are not interested in humans, and their downfall has nothing to do with humanity's arrival. The Shoggoth's presence in Antarctica is not a threat to our world, but an echo of a world that never included us. In this context, the human characters, Dyer and Danforth, are less explorers than intruders. They arrive at a stage long after the play has ended, and their only reward for watching is madness. Lovecraft writes, "It was a terrible, indescribable thing, vaster than any subway train, a shapeless congeries of protoplasmic bubbles, with myriads of temporary eyes forming and unforming as it moved." The description is grotesque, but what makes it terrifying is the implication of permanence. The Shoggoth is not transient. It has lasted. It survived the collapse of its creators, adapted to new environments, and perhaps most unsettlingly, remembered. In contrast, the humans are fragile, bound by time, prone to psychological disintegration. This disparity enacts the core Lovecraftian proposition. The universe is not designed for us, and we do not matter to it. The Shoggoth, indifferent and enduring, becomes a measure of our irrelevance. Closely tied to this is the concept of entropy, the slow, irreversible drift from order to disorder. In most horror fiction, entropy takes the form of decay, rotting flesh, crumbling buildings, forgotten names. But in Lovecraft's cosmology, entropy operates at a deeper level. It is not just the breakdown of material things, but the breakdown of coherence itself. Knowledge does not save, it dissolves. Control does not persist, it collapses. The elder things, once supreme in their biological mastery, are ultimately undone by the very beings they constructed. The Shoggoths are not evil. They are not even rebellious in the moral sense. They are simply the result of a long process of adaptation, a process indifferent to intention. Evolution in Lovecraft's fiction does not have direction. It only has momentum. And that momentum, unchecked, results in entropy, not merely of biology, but of meaning. Consider the murals discovered by the expedition in At the Mountains of Madness. They depict the rise and fall of the elder things, their scientific achievements, their wars, and ultimately their creation of the Shoggoths. But the last murals show something else, something hinted at rather than explained. A slow reversal, a time when the servants became too efficient, too independent. What began as delegation became obsolescence. This is not revolution, but entropy masquerading as progress. The more adaptable the Shoggoths became, the less necessary their creators were, until, at last, the elder things dwindled into myth, and the Shoggoths remained, formless, functional, eternal. We must recognize this narrative for what it is, not a moral fall, but a thermodynamic one. Energy dispersed, structure collapsed, life continued, but not in a way that meant anything. The third and final concept embedded in the Shoggoth myth is that of dream reality, the sense that the world we perceive is not fixed, but contingent upon perception itself. Lovecraft repeatedly blurs the line between waking knowledge and dream experience. In The Shadow, out of time, memory is exchanged across time and bodies. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, entire cities exist only as dreamed architectures. The Shoggoth, though not explicitly dreamlike, emerges from an unreal place, beneath the ice, beneath the known, beneath the surface of comprehension. Its fluidity, its mimicry, and its resistance to stable form all suggest something nightmarish, made flesh. When Dyer and Danforth flee from it, what haunts them is not just the sight of the thing, but the sense that it has always been there, watching, waiting, repeating a call it cannot possibly understand. Tekelili, the cry that echoes through the corridors of the dead city, is a perfect symbol of this dream logic. It has no translation, no semantic anchor, yet it is repeated compulsively, like a refrain from a forgotten dream. The Shoggoth does not know what it means, and yet it continues to say it. This mechanical repetition of meaningless language mirrors the way dreams echo fears we cannot articulate. The deeper implication is unsettling. Perhaps consciousness itself is a repetition of signals we never originated. Perhaps memory is mimicry. Perhaps reality, as we understand it, is only the brief surface between deeper, formless levels of meaninglessness. The Shoggoth is not a dream creature in aesthetic terms. It is a dream creature in ontological terms. It should not exist, but it persists. We must pause here and reflect on the nature of fear itself. In most narratives, fear arises from confrontation with an external threat, a vampire, a demon, a murderer. But Lovecraft reorients this structure. His fear is internal, abstract, and philosophical. It is not fear of death, but fear of continuation without meaning. The Shoggoth is terrifying not because it kills, but because it survives. It outlives all context, all order, all language. It reveals that the universe not only doesn't care about us, it doesn't even know we're here. It will repeat its forms, its cries, its patterns whether we exist or not. And that, ultimately, is Lovecraft's central horror. Not destruction, but persistence without purpose. The Shoggoth does not exist in isolation. It is a product of interaction, an outgrowth of a forgotten lineage of creators, sub-creators, and interdimensional forces. To understand its full symbolic and mythological significance, we must map its place within the broader architecture of Lovecraft's cosmic pantheon. The Shoggoth is not a god, nor is it a demon. It is an artifact of a failed empire, a discarded tool, and yet also a survivor. It stands at the intersection of biology, memory, and metaphysics, linked to the elder things who made it, echoing across the dreamlands it never consciously entered, and resonating with greater cosmic intelligences it may never fully comprehend. It is this ambiguity, its status as both local and cosmic, designed and emergent, that gives the Shoggoth its unique philosophical weight in the mythos. The elder, things, or old ones, are the primary force behind the Shoggoth's existence, described in At the Mountains of Madness as barrel-shaped, tentacled, starfish-headed beings. They are among Lovecraft's most detailed creations. Far from being mystical or divine, they are profoundly material. Biologists, artists, and scientists operating billions of years before humanity emerged. Their civilization, centered in Antarctica and extending across primordial oceans, was based on genetic manipulation and aesthetic architecture. The Shoggoths were crafted by these beings as organic labor, formless, obedient, capable of surviving extreme environments and performing complex tasks. But their servitude, like all systems based on dominance, eventually unraveled. The elder things, despite their cosmic age and sophistication, lost control of what they had created. This reversal is central. It is not the collapse of a magical order, but of a rational one. Knowledge, in Lovecraft's universe, does not guarantee safety. Lovecraft hints that the elder things may have fled or perished not simply due to rebellion, but due to their own stagnation. In this reading, the Shoggoths were not destroyers, but evolutionary successors, chaotic yet adaptive, lacking culture but possessing resilience. They represent biological potential divorced from artistic or intellectual purpose, and yet, disturbingly, they mimic such purpose. They echo the cries of their masters. They navigate the ruins. They persist. It is not simply that the Shoggoths replace the elder things. It is that they continue them imperfectly and mindlessly, like a degraded memory playing on loop. This mimicry blurs the line between legacy and error. The very force that once served civilization now replays its voice in an empty city. We must now consider a wider question. Where do Shoggoths fall in relation to other cosmic entities in Lovecraft's universe? While not directly linked to beings such as Nyarlathotep, Azathoth, or Yog-Sothoth, the Shoggoth participates in their logic. These greater beings are not gods in any traditional sense. They are metaphysical principles: chaos, time, the totality of space. Azathoth, the blind idiot god, is the symbol of cosmic meaninglessness. Yog-Sothoth is the gate, the key, and the guardian of all dimensions, suggesting total awareness without morality. The Shoggoth does not interact with these forces, but it resembles them in its amorphousness, its lack of stable identity, its function as a biological force that exceeds moral judgment. If Azathoth is the chaos behind reality, the Shoggoth is its biological echo, chaotic matter shaped temporarily into usefulness, destined to return to formlessness. It is not an avatar, but a reflection, flesh mirroring principle. There is, too, a spectral link between the Shoggoth and the Dreamlands, that other vast, shifting dimension in Lovecraft's mythos where unconscious minds wander. Though the Shoggoth does not appear in stories set in the Dreamlands, it is described in terms that resonate with dream logic, its mutability, its incoherence, its resistance to stable identity. The Dreamlands operate on a logic where desire, memory, and form constantly shift. The Shoggoth, too, is capable of forming eyes, mouths, limbs, only to dissolve them again. It is not bound by a single shape, and thus not bound by a single function. In this sense, it behaves like a nightmare creature pulled into the waking world, a dream made literal, biology hallucinating itself into permanence. The question arises, if the Dreamlands are shaped by mind, what is a creature that mimics form without ever possessing one? We must pause here and consider a disturbing implication. The Shoggoth, created by the elder things and echoing the patterns of higher beings, might itself be a vessel, not consciously, not intentionally, but structurally. Its protoplasmic flexibility makes it a perfect container for memory, for mimicry, perhaps even for possession. What if the Shoggoths were never just tools, but receptacles? What if, like the fungoid Mi-Go or the hybrid deep ones, they represent not just a lost experiment, but a continuing experiment, an open wound in biology waiting to be inhabited by something else? This speculative framework places the Shoggoth in proximity to forces far beyond its own awareness. It may not know what it contains, but it may contain nonetheless. Lovecraft often plays with this kind of latent implication. He leaves threads unstated, possibilities open. In The Whisperer in Darkness, the Mi-Go extract human brains and store them in cylinders, allowing them to travel across space. in the shadow. Out of time, the great race of Yith swaps consciousness with beings from other epochs. These entities are not evil. They are curious, detached. The Shoggoth, in contrast, is not curious, but it may host curiosity. It may be the blank slate upon which greater minds write. Its lack of identity becomes its strength, an organism that can carry any voice, any shape, any imprint. This is not possession in the religious sense, but in the ontological one, a thing that has no self, and thus can wear any self. This reveals something profound about the structure of cosmic horror. There are no villains, only vectors. The elder things vector into Shoggoths, the Shoggoths vector into something deeper, and we, encountering them through narrative, become vectors ourselves, carrying the horror into interpretation, memory, and reflection. The Shoggoth is not the endpoint of fear. It is a midpoint in a network of forces that stretch beyond time, identity, or intent. It is not malevolent, but its formlessness becomes a conduit for the malevolent. Not evil, but available to evil. Within Lovecraft's cosmology, it is not violence, but encounter that induces madness. Physical harm is rare. Psychological collapse is inevitable. Nowhere is this principle more precisely illustrated than in the Shoggoth. Unlike many traditional monsters, the Shoggoth does not stalk, seduce, or even explain. It simply is. Its presence alone constitutes an assault on the coherence of the human mind. It is not merely the creature's appearance that induces horror, but the realization of what it implies, the vast pre-human history it carries, the failed mastery it represents, and the mimicked voices of long-dead creators it repeats. In the world of At the Mountains of Madness, the mind does not break from terror alone, but from pattern recognition, recognizing too much, too quickly, and in the wrong direction. The protagonists of Lovecraft's polar expedition, Dyer and Danforth, do not descend into madness from any supernatural ritual or violent event. Rather, it is the process of learning that drives them toward the edge. As they descend through the abandoned city of the elder things, they observe murals that detail eons of civilization, conquest, science, and eventual decline. The initial emotional response is wonder, intellectual stimulation at the scale of the discovery. But this wonder becomes dread as they realize that the history does not end with ruin, but with survival. The murals suggest something remained, and that something, as they soon discover, is the Shoggoth. Their encounter with it is brief, just enough to glimpse its form, hear its cry, and understand its implication. And that, Lovecraft insists, is enough to unravel a human mind. We must recognize that madness, in this context, is not a sudden collapse, but an epistemic fracture, a shattering of the structures by which the world is understood. Dyer, writing the narrative, maintains a tone of strained rationality. He is not raving, but trying not to. Danforth, in contrast, is lost. After the encounter, he begins to speak of cities in the sky, shapes that don't conform to geometry, and sounds that shouldn't echo in the waking world. The Shoggoth does not chase them as a predator. It follows them as a presence. Its mimicry of the elder things' cry, Tekelile, functions as a mocking echo, but also as a traumatic imprint. This is not language in the communicative sense, but in the psychological, a sound that reopens the wound of comprehension. What is heard cannot be unheard. Consider carefully. The function of the Shoggoth in this narrative is not to threaten the body, but to corrupt the cognitive frame. It is not evil, but indifferent, and that indifference is unbearable. The human mind, Lovecraft suggests, is built to withstand suffering, but not insignificance. It can endure terror, but not truth. The truth that the Shoggoth brings is layered. It tells us we were not first, we are not central, and we are not even noticed. It does not gaze at us with hunger or hatred. It does not gaze at all. Its mimicry of speech is mechanical, its mobility effortless, its presence persistent. The horror is not that it seeks us out, but that we stumbled into its residual domain, an accidental collision with something that has no interest in us whatsoever. This effect is not limited to At the Mountains of Madness. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, the protagonist's descent into madness is also triggered by realization rather than attack. There is a pattern in Lovecraft's work. Knowledge accumulates, anomalies appear, the frame cracks, and the final understanding is unbearable. Madness is thus not a punishment, but a consequence, a natural result of encountering a universe that contradicts our deepest assumptions. The Shoggoth, by its very design, destabilizes categories. It has no fixed shape, no fixed voice, no fixed morality. It is not animal, not machine, not sentient in the human sense. It simply is, and this isness is corrosive to minds trained to classify and control. We may compare this to the psychological concept of the uncanny valley, the unsettling effect of entities that are almost human, but not quite. The Shoggoth amplifies this phenomenon to cosmic proportions. Its mimicry is not functional, it is residual. It remembers speech without meaning, movement without intention. In this way, it becomes not only physically uncanny, but ontologically so. The mind, encountering such a being, cannot stabilize it within known frameworks. It is not predator, not ghost, not alien, not God. It is too much and too little at once. And in that ambiguity, the psyche frays. This reveals something profound about the relationship between horror and cognition. Lovecraft's monsters do not scare us by overwhelming the senses, but by overwhelming the structures of sense-making. The Shoggoth is a living contradiction, a created being that survives its creators, a biological form that rejects stability, a linguistic entity that repeats dead voices. Its presence fractures the human desire for order, and once that fracture begins, there is no return. This is why Dyer pleads with future expeditions not to continue, not because the Shoggoths will kill them, but because they will understand them. If Lovecraft's horror has a center, it is not a place, not a creature, not even a cosmic entity. It is knowledge. More specifically, it is forbidden knowledge, knowledge that should not be known, not because it is illegal or immoral, but because the human mind is structurally unfit to process it. In this framework, the Shoggoth functions not merely as a monster, but as a revelation, a living repository of truths that were never meant to be uncovered. It is the biological residue of a pre-human history, the material evidence of a civilizational failure, and the embodied proof that intelligent life can devolve into useful instability. To encounter a Shoggoth is not just to see a terrifying creature, it is to stumble upon a lost library, a biological archive, a scream fossilized into motion, and it is the attempt to interpret this archive that causes the epistemic collapse. The phrase forbidden knowledge implies a boundary between what is safe to know and what is not. Lovecraft's narrators consistently cross that boundary, often under the banner of science, archaeology, or rational curiosity. In At the Mountains of Madness, Dyer and his team do not seek terror. they seek understanding. The descent into the Antarctic ruins is framed not as a mythic journey, but as a geological survey. The horror emerges not in contradiction to science, but through it. The murals they discover do not scream, but instruct. They depict an ordered history, the rise of the elder things, their creation of the Shoggoths, their wars, and their decline. At first, these discoveries are exhilarating, but then comes the realization the Shoggoths were not destroyed. They endured, and their endurance invalidates every comforting narrative of progress, hierarchy, and control. We must recognize that the collapse here is not factual, but epistemic. The facts remain. The murals are accurate. The biology is observable. But the meaning of those facts unravels. Knowledge, in Lovecraft's mythos, is corrosive, not because it is false, but because it is too true. It reveals a universe that functions without us, evolves without direction, and forgets without grief. The Shoggoth is the climax of this revelation, a being that should not exist, yet does, a voice that should be extinct, yet echoes. Its cry of Tekeli Li is not a communication, it is a mnemonic scar, and hearing it is not simply terrifying, it is disorienting. The mind, faced with a being that is both alive and dead, ancient and purposeless, mimetic and mute, loses its ability to categorize, and with that loss comes madness. This theme of epistemic collapse pervades Lovecraft's mythos. In the Call of Cthulhu, the narrator pieces together scattered documents, dreams, and testimonies, only to discover a cosmic truth he cannot bear. In the Shadow, out of time, the protagonist's recovered memories span millennia and multiple bodies, but what terrifies him is not their content, but the recognition that his self is not stable. Similarly, the Shoggoth destabilizes the boundary between past and present, creator and creation, servant and sovereign. It exists as a question with no answer. What happens when knowledge outlives intention? The elder things created the Shoggoths for utility, but when the civilization collapsed, the knowledge embedded in the Shoggoths, biological memory, linguistic mimicry, adaptive function, survived. It became knowledge without purpose, and that purposeless knowledge haunts the reader more than any overt malevolence. Consider carefully, Lovecraft does not treat knowledge as redemptive. There is no arc of discovery leading to enlightenment. Rather, knowledge is a trapdoor, disguised as progress, opened by reason, and leading downward into incoherence. The Shoggoth is the being waiting beneath that door. Its form cannot be fixed. Its function cannot be interpreted. And in this ambiguity, it becomes an epistemological threat. To know it is to know too much, and knowing too much is indistinguishable from madness. This is not a moral punishment. It is a structural failure. The human mind, designed by evolution to navigate a narrow band of experience, cannot contain the implications of entities like the Shoggoth. It can observe, record, even describe, but it cannot synthesize. The horror is not just that the mind breaks, but that the break reveals how fragile it always was. The concept of forbidden knowledge in Lovecraft's work thus operates on two levels, narrative and meta-narrative. Within the story, characters suffer because they uncover secrets too vast to hold. But for the reader, the deeper horror is realizing that the story itself is a form of transmission. By reading it, we inherit the knowledge. We participate in the unfolding. The final lines of At the Mountains of Madness are not merely a warning. They are an act of containment. Dyer pleads with the scientific community not to revisit the ruins, not because he fears for their lives, but because he fears for their understanding. I could not help feeling that they were evil things, mountains of madness whose farther slopes looked out over some accursed ultimate abyss. The abyss is not geographical, it is conceptual. This reveals something profound. The Shoggoth is not only a threat within the narrative, it is a philosophical agent of collapse. Its presence forces us to question the validity of discovery, the value of knowledge, and the possibility of comprehension. It teaches, but what it teaches cannot be assimilated. And that is Lovecraft's most terrifying suggestion, that the universe does not hide its secrets out of malice, but out of indifference. The secrets are there. We may find them, but we will not survive their meaning. The Shoggoths' first and most formative appearance occurs in At the Mountains of Madness, written in 1931, published in 1936. But the creature's conceptual ancestry reaches back through several earlier texts in Lovecraft's oeuvre. To fully appreciate the Shoggoth's literary function, we must trace not only its canonical debut, but also the subterranean threads, linguistic, thematic, and symbolic, that prefigured its arrival. Lovecraft's method was not to invent in isolation, but to accrete meaning through suggestion, cross-reference, and mythic layering. In this context, the Shoggoth did not appear out of nowhere. It emerged from a slow, deliberate weaving of motifs, formlessness, mimicry, servitude, and revolt. Its arrival in mountains is not a beginning, but a culmination. In The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, we find an early prototype of the Shoggoth in the form of the great amorphous flabby thing, described as lurking in the nightmare city of Rulia. Although this creature is later identified as Cthulhu himself, the language used, gelatinous, protoplasmic, monstrous beyond all imagining, bears an uncanny resemblance to the future Shoggoth's biological design. This proto-description demonstrates Lovecraft's recurring fascination with formlessness as a metaphor for unknowability. More importantly, it establishes a narrative principle he would refine in Mountains, the dread of encountering a thing whose boundaries, physical, cognitive, and moral, refuse to stabilize. Even in this earlier story, the horror is not simply the thing itself, but the encounter with its immensity and indifference. Another important precursor appears in the Dunwich Horror, 1928, where the creature Wilbur Whately and his brother, born of a union between a human woman and the eldritch god Yog-Sothoth, display unnatural biology and monstrous development. While these entities are not Shoggoths in form, they share key thematic traits: engineered monstrosity, inherited knowledge, and eventual rebellion against containment. In the case of the invisible brother, described as an unseen presence that leaves massive, inhuman tracks, the resemblance to the Shoggoth's later portrayal is unmistakable. The story rehearses an important narrative pattern. Human discovery leads to revelation, revelation leads to terror, and terror leads to the collapse of explanatory frameworks. In each case, the horror is archival. What we learn ruins what we knew. The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, offers yet another layer of intertextual preparation. The alien Migo are not amorphous, but they similarly blur the lines between technology and biology. Their ability to extract and preserve human brains for interstellar travel resonates with the Shoggoth's role as a biological memory bank, retaining language, behavior, and function long after its creators are gone. The Migo do not kill the mind, they dislocate it. The Shoggoth, too, induces not death, but disintegration. of meaning, of self, of linguistic order. Across these stories, we see Lovecraft gradually crafting a bestiary of beings that are terrifying not in their malice, but in their structure. The Shoggoth simply becomes the most distilled form of this tendency. When the Shoggoth finally arrives at the Mountains of Madness, it does so with a literary gravity Lovecraft has been building toward for years. It is described with clinical detail. A terrible, indescribable thing, vaster than any subway train. A shapeless congeries of protoplasmic bubbles, faintly self-luminous, and with myriads of temporary eyes forming and unforming. The horror here is not only visual, but grammatical. The cascade of clauses mimics the creature's formless growth. The sentence bloats. This deliberate linguistic mimicry, structure mirroring subject, is a hallmark of Lovecraft's mature style. The Shoggoth is not simply a creature in the story. It colonizes the narration itself, disrupting clarity, elongating syntax, deforming language the way it deforms biology. The very act of describing the thing becomes an ordeal of containment. What's notable is how the Shoggoth's role differs from other mythos entities. Cthulhu sleeps, Nyarlathotep plays, Azathoth dreams, but the Shoggoth works. It labors, adapts, survives. It is not sacred nor infernal. It is residual. This status places it in a liminal narrative position. It is not the antagonist, not the mystery, not the god. It is the consequence, the unintended remainder of a long-abandoned system. And this position makes it uniquely terrifying because it implies that the story is not about the Shoggoth at all. It's about the collapse of context. The Shoggoth is the punctuation at the end of a forgotten sentence, wandering the ruins of a paragraph whose subject has long since eroded. We must also consider the larger intertextual ecosystem of the mythos. The Necronomicon, Lovecraft's most famous fictional grimoire, does not directly mention Shoggoths, but its aura permeates the world in which they exist. The book's whispered pages, written by the mad Arab Abdul al-Izred, contain fragments of pre-human history and the taxonomy of beings whose names break minds. Although the Shoggoth is not a magical entity, its presence is aligned with the aesthetic of the forbidden text. The idea that some knowledge does not explain but undermines. In this way, the Shoggoth is the biological counterpart to the Necronomicon, not a book, but a living codex, unreadable yet remembered. Both function as triggers for narrative unraveling. Both are read, and both leave the reader forever changed. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's literary design. The Shoggoth was not invented in a single moment. It was grown, narratively, conceptually, mythologically. Its earliest appearances were not literal, but gestational, motifs of mutability, miscreation, and biological inheritance echoing across multiple texts. When it finally appeared, it did so with the accumulated weight of these precursors. It was not new, but familiar in a new form, and this familiarity is part of its horror. It reminds us that we have seen its outlines before, shadows on the wall of the cave, but only now do we realize what they were pointing toward. Of all Lovecraft's works, At the Mountains of Madness is arguably the most ambitious in scope and the most methodically constructed. Written in 1931 and rejected by Weird Tales for its dense, report-like tone, the novella is now recognized as the canonical unveiling of the Shoggoth. Here, the creature is not simply introduced. It is revealed through sedimented narrative layers, each more disorienting than the last. The text presents itself as a scientific document, a first-person suppression report by Dr. William Dyer of Miskatonic University. His stated aim is to prevent further expeditions into Antarctica, not out of fear for safety, but out of horror at the truth buried beneath the ice. That truth, ultimately, is the Shoggoth, not merely a creature, but a living remainder of a pre-human world, a biological echo that has outlived its context. The story builds toward this revelation with agonizing patience. Early on, the focus is geological, plateaus, striations, fossil layers, then archaeological, strange ruins, alien glyphs, murals carved into basalt. Only gradually does the biological horror seep in, first through the dissection of enigmatic life forms by the advanced team, then through the disappearance and mutilation of that same team. But it is not until Dyer and his surviving colleague Danforth descend into the labyrinthine city that the narrative reveals its true trajectory. Here they encounter the murals, effectively a history carved in stone, detailing the rise of the Elder Things, their creation of the Shoggoths as laborers, and their eventual downfall. This slow disclosure transforms the story from a mystery into a cosmic parable, a tale of hubris, decay, and unintended survival. When the Shoggoth finally appears, sudden and immense, it is described not in dramatic terms, but in cold biological precision. A terrible, indescribable thing vaster than any subway train, a shapeless congeries of protoplasmic bubbles, faintly self-luminous, with myriads of temporary eyes, forming and unforming. This description is clinical, yet surreal. The monster defies static imagery. It is a process, not a shape. The bubbling, self-luminous mass, with flickering eyes, violates the reader's visual imagination. In cinematic terms, it cannot be held in frame. Lovecraft's prose mimics this visual elusiveness. The sentence itself runs long, accumulative, unstable. The horror is not what it does. It is what it is, a being with no fixed form, no moral center, and no need for the masters it once served. The narrative function of the Shoggoth in Mountains is profound. It serves not as antagonist, but as proof. Its presence confirms the mural's account, affirms the biological reality of the Elder Things, and underscores the duration of their downfall. The Shoggoth is not an agent of destruction, it is the evidence of destruction. Its continued existence reveals that the collapse of order was total, yet not final. Something persists, and that persistence, formless, imitative, unconstrained, is what drives Danforth to madness. Notably, the story ends not with confrontation, but with retreat. Dyer and Danforth flee. They do not battle, they do not win. They survive, barely, and only by escaping with their minds fractured and their worldview ruined. We must pause here to consider the auditory detail that haunts the final scenes. It was the utter, objective embodiment of the fantastic novelist's thing that should not be, and its nearest comprehensible analog is a crawling chaos of living bubbles, all the while echoing with a dismal and repetitious sound. Tekelili, tekelili. The cry, borrowed from Poe's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, functions as both diegetic sound and intertextual marker. In Poe, it signifies an approaching mystery. In Lovecraft, it becomes an echo of mimicry. The Shoggoth does not speak, it repeats. This repetition is not communicative, but mimetic. It recalls its creator's cries as a habit, not a memory. And this echo is what truly unravels the human characters. Danforth is broken not by the sight of the Shoggoth, but by what he sees afterward. Something about the size of a large building with a face. The suggestion is never resolved. The ambiguity intensifies the horror. The final lines of the story are warnings, not conclusions. Lovecraft's Shoggoth is inseparable from the structure of At the Mountains of Madness itself. The story's slow, geological pacing mirrors the theme of discovery through layers, literal strata of time and narrative. Each level of descent brings not catharsis, but disillusionment. The Shoggoth emerges not as a climax, but as a correction. It recontextualizes everything that came before. It is the living footnote at the end of a dead civilization story. And crucially, it is still there. The horror is not in what the Shoggoth might do, but in what it has already outlived. It has no agenda, but its presence renders human frameworks, history, morality, biology, irrelevant. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's narrative strategy. The Shoggoth is never the focal point of the plot. It is the gravity around which the plot bends. It does not need a backstory. It is the backstory. Its existence transforms every earlier discovery from marvel to omen, and its mimicry of speech, repeating Tekeli Lee endlessly, is not a sign of intelligence, but of haunted biology. It remembers not through thought, but through structure. In this sense, the Shoggoth is not a being. It is a remainder, and that is why it cannot be defeated, only avoided. If At the Mountains of Madness is Lovecraft's archaeological descent into biological horror, then The Shadow, Out of Time, written 1934-35, published 1936, represents his most ambitious philosophical meditation on memory, identity, and the instability of self. Though Shoggoths are never directly named in this tale, the themes and structures they embody, biological continuity, mimicry, survival beyond context, are profoundly echoed in the narrative. More than that, Shadow offers a conceptual analog to the Shoggoth, a creature not of flesh but of mind, a sentient consciousness that, like the protoplasmic being, slips between bodies, defies form, and persists through time by inhabiting others. To understand the full literary function of the Shoggoth in Lovecraft's canon, The Shadow Out of Time must be read not as a separate story, but as a parallel manifestation of the same underlying terror. The story follows Professor Nathaniel Wingate Peaslee, a Miskatonic University academic who suffers a 5-year fugue state during which an unknown intelligence inhabits his body. Upon awakening, Peaslee slowly uncovers evidence through personal notes, family accounts, and ultimately a vast expedition into the Australian desert that he had been possessed by an entity from the so-called Great Race of Yeth. This alien species survives across epochs by projecting their minds through time into other beings, using them as vessels for knowledge gathering and preservation. The process is not malevolent, but it is deeply violating. Peaslee's horror is not rooted in physical harm, but in the realization that his identity is permeable, that his mind, like his body, is not sovereign. This insight mirrors, in intellectual form, the existential violation caused by encountering a Shoggoth. Both stories pivot on a similar dynamic, the discovery that history is not linear, but recursive, and that what survives is not civilization, but function. Just as the Shoggoth continues its mimicry long after the elder things have vanished, the Yithians leap between eras, collecting knowledge and using bodies as tools. The distinction lies in medium. The Shoggoth is a biological echo. The Yithians are cognitive intruders, but both unsettle the same human presumption that the self is stable and protected. In Peaslee's case, this collapse is gradual, experienced first as dreams, then as inexplicable familiarity with ancient languages and knowledge he could not possibly have acquired. In the Antarctic tale, the epistemic break comes from seeing a being that should not be. In Shadow, it comes from being a being he should never have been. Consider the passage in which Peasley describes his dream visions. I seemed to be a conscious mind, living in an alien body, a great, towering cone of eldritch matter with a ridged barrel for torso, strange appendages, and a crown of sensory stalks. This description closely resembles the elder things, creatures associated with the creation of the Shoggoths. While the Yithians are distinct entities, they too are implicated in the same pre-human continuum. The body Peasley inhabits is itself a foreign form, unsettlingly biological, yet mental. The sensory confusion, his awareness trapped in something unrecognizable, parallels the horror of the Shoggoth, a being that looks back but without a face, that speaks but without meaning. Both stories induce terror, not through violence, but through ontological dissonance. What connects these narratives most intimately is the concept of survival without origin. The Yithians do not possess a native time. They move endlessly forward, leaping into other hosts as their previous forms face extinction. They survive through displacement. Similarly, the Shoggoth survives, not because it was intended to, but because its structure allows it to. Both are functions without narrative. They persist, adapt, and replicate without reference to a beginning or end. Lovecraft leaves it ambiguous whether this survival is admirable, horrifying, or simply inevitable. But he is clear on one point. It renders human models of history and identity obsolete. We must pause here to reflect on the role of the archive. In At the Mountains of Madness, the city of the elder things is an archive of stone with murals as texts. In Shadow, the Yithians construct vast libraries carved into subterranean chambers filled with metal cylinders of recorded consciousness. In both cases, knowledge is not sacred. It is heavy, accumulated, and dangerous. Peasley's ultimate horror comes not from what he remembers, but from what he confirms. He finds the library in Australia. He recognizes it, and he finds a cylinder containing what may have been himself, a terrifying double confirmation that the dreams were real, that the invasion of self occurred, and that the process could repeat. Knowledge, once again, leads not to enlightenment, but to collapse. Importantly, the narrative arc of Shadow mirrors that of Mountains: investigation, revelation, and retreat. Peasley, like Dyer, ends his account with a plea: do not dig further, do not study more, do not awaken what has been preserved by ice, or stone, or time. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's use of scientific protagonists. They do not lose their minds because they are irrational, but because they are too rational. Their pursuit of knowledge is precise, careful, and intellectually honest, and that is exactly what makes it fatal. The more they understand, the less they can inhabit the world they once thought real. This is the Lovecraftian model of madness, not chaos, but understanding carried one step too far. In this way, the Shadow, out of time, becomes a philosophical companion to the Shoggoth. Though the entity never appears, its logic pervades the story. Peasley is haunted by memory without source, identity without body, knowledge without explanation. The Shoggoth is its physical analog, form without stability, voice without speaker, survival without context. Together, these narratives expose the deeper horror behind all of Lovecraft's work. Not that the universe is hostile, but that it is impersonal. We are not punished. We are ignored. And in that indifference, even the self can dissolve. The legacy of the Shoggoth did not end with Lovecraft's death in 1937. Instead, it became a central thread in the evolving tapestry of what came to be known as the Cthulhu mythos, a term Lovecraft himself never used. In the decades following his death, a network of admirers, collaborators, and literary heirs sought to continue, clarify, and in some cases, reinterpret the universe he had left deliberately fragmented. Among these, August Derleth looms largest. As the co-founder of Arkham House, Derleth was instrumental in preserving Lovecraft's work and shaping his posthumous reputation. But in doing so, Derleth also introduced a theological structure into a mythos that had been, until that point, rigorously indifferent. Nowhere is this shift more evident and more philosophically disruptive than in the later portrayals of the Shoggoth. Derleth sought to impose moral order upon Lovecraft's cosmos. He categorized entities into elder gods and great old ones, aligning them with elemental and moral forces: air, fire, earth, water, good, evil, neutral. Within this framework, the Shoggoth was sometimes referred to as a water elemental, a classification that, while evocative, deeply undermines its original function. To call the Shoggoth an elemental being is to reduce it to a slot in a cosmic taxonomy, stripping it of the very formlessness that made it terrifying. It is not simply that Derleth misunderstood Lovecraft's vision, it is that he attempted to complete it, to systematize the unsystematizable. In so doing, he turned the Shoggoth from an ontological threat into a kind of mythological placeholder. It became a creature to be fought rather than a presence to be endured. This impulse toward containment extended beyond Derleth. Writers such as Brian Lumley, Ramsey Campbell, and Lynn Carter all expanded the mythos in ways that often reintroduced human agency and moral clarity. Lumley, for instance, in his Titus Crow series, reimagines the mythos as an arena of struggle where heroes can arm themselves with arcane knowledge and challenge the horrors from beyond. In this context, the Shoggoth occasionally appears not as an unknowable force, but as a combatable adversary, even a tool, sometimes summoned, sometimes controlled. This shift marks a significant departure from Lovecraft's foundational principle that the universe is not only uncaring, but incomprehensible. In Lumley's work, the Shoggoth becomes a monster in the classical sense, dangerous, but ultimately knowable. We must pause here to recognize a recurring tension, the impulse to narrativize what was intended as unnarratable. Lovecraft's horror does not rely on plot resolution or moral struggle. It relies on encounter, a moment when the familiar order collapses. The Shoggoth, in its original form, was not an opponent to be vanquished, but a biological inevitability. It could not be reasoned with, and it did not possess agency in the human sense. Later expansions, by contrast, often recast it as a participant in mythic drama, a creature with motivations, alliances, or narrative roles. In the world of pulp fiction and role-playing games, this made sense. Monsters need stats, alignment, and weaknesses, but in literary terms, it represents a kind of epistemic betrayal. The Shoggoth was never meant to be understood. Perhaps the most significant of these transformations occurred through the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, 1981, which solidified many popular conceptions of Lovecraft's creatures. In the game, Shoggoths have hit points, attack values, and behavior patterns. They can be fought, fled from, or researched in terms of weaknesses and resistances. This shift, understandable within the logic of gaming, nonetheless domesticates the Shoggoth. It becomes less a philosophical rupture and more a tactical challenge. Its cries, once signifiers of post-linguistic memory, now become combat cues. What was once an unspeakable biological accident is now rendered in diagrams, miniatures, and monster manuals. It is not that these reimaginings are wrong. It is that they serve a different function. They entertain. Lovecraft's original Shoggoth, by contrast, was meant to disturb. Some later writers, however, approached the Shoggoth with greater fidelity to Lovecraft's vision. Thomas Ligotti, though never directly invoking Shoggoths, channels their logic in his fiction. His characters confront entities and truths that induce collapse rather than confrontation. Ligotti does not reinterpret Lovecraft. He extends his implications. Similarly, Caitlin R. Kiernan's work preserves the ambiguity and fluid horror associated with the mythos, often centering on memory, biology, and unreliable perception, motifs that resonate with the Shoggoth's symbolic register. These writers understand that the Shoggoth is not frightening because of what it does, but because of what it reveals. That function can survive intention, that structure can outlive thought, and that horror does not need a personality to endure. This reveals something profound about the nature of literary afterlives. Creatures like the Shoggoth are not merely inherited, they are translated, and in translation, meaning shifts. The post-Lovecraftian Shoggoth often becomes an object of fascination, a creature to be illustrated, adapted, even fetishized, but this fascination risks reducing it to spectacle. The original Shoggoth was not spectacle, it was the collapse of coherence, a lesson encoded in flesh. Its horror was not in its shape, but in its unshapeliness, not in its danger, but in its indifference. In this way, later expansions, however well-intentioned, often obscure what was most radical about the creature. The Shoggoth, as Lovecraft envisioned it, was never confined to fiction alone. Its form was literary, but its function was mimetic. It was a horror designed not merely to unsettle a reader in the moment, but to implant itself, viscous and lingering, in cultural memory. What has followed in the decades since its initial appearance is less a line of faithful adaptation than a diffusion of presence. The Shoggoth has bled into conspiracy theories, urban legends, internet hoaxes, and digital folklore. Stripped of name and mythological context, its shape persists. It reemerges as a rumor, a video glitch, a voice on a forgotten frequency. And this too is part of Lovecraft's design, a horror that survives, not because it is believed, but because it is retold. Among the most notable modern parallels to the Shoggoth are the blobs that appear sporadically in cryptozoological reports and local news stories. One infamous case occurred in 1958 in Philadelphia, where police discovered a large gelatinous mass, purplish, odorless, and dissolving on contact. The ball headlines dubbed it the Philadelphia Blob, and while it was quickly dismissed by authorities as a jellyfish or mass of industrial waste, its uncanny resemblance to Lovecraft's creature was not lost on commentators. Similar accounts have appeared in North Carolina, 1995, Japan 2003, and most recently, in a widely circulated video from rural Brazil, 2021, showing a slithering mass dragging itself across a flooded street. None of these have been conclusively explained, but none of them need to be. Their power lies in their suggestiveness. They echo Lovecraft without attribution. In online spaces, the Shoggoth has been reborn in digital mythologies like the SCP Foundation, a collaborative fiction platform where writers document fictional anomalies using clinical, bureaucratic language. Creatures like SCP-99 and SCP-682 display Shoggoth-like properties, formless, adaptive, biologically unstable. But more importantly, the style of writing itself, a scientific voice describing something fundamentally unscientific, mimics Lovecraft's method in At the Mountains of Madness. Here, the horror comes not from emotional reaction, but from documentation. The reader encounters the thing not through narrative drama, but through files, logs, and institutional records. This is the Shoggoth's modern form, not as a visible monster, but as a footnote in an ominous database, a classified video feed, a redacted paragraph hinting at containment failure. Even in the fringes of paranormal conspiracy, Shoggoth echoes appear. In certain circles, theories about Antarctic anomalies continue to circulate. Claims of lost cities beneath the ice, satellite images showing unnatural structures, even suggestions of Nazi bases encountering bioconstructs left by ancient races. One notorious hoax involved a YouTube video supposedly showing a US Navy team exploring a glacial cavern containing living tissue. The footage, grainy, silent, and inconclusive, was debunked within days, but its language, borrowed from scientific jargon and saturated with implications of forbidden history, followed Lovecraft's exact narrative model. It is not the content of such stories that matters, but the structure, expedition, anomaly, partial evidence, disappearance. In this way, the Shoggoth survives as an information pattern, not just a creature. We must recognize the psychological reason why these sightings and fabrications persist. The Shoggoth represents more than a monster. It represents a rupture in assumed reality. In a world increasingly defined by surveillance, data, and scientific control, the idea that something could exist outside our frameworks is both thrilling and destabilizing. The blob that resists classification, the footage that cannot be authenticated, the organism that mimics but does not think. These all activate a fear older than the Shoggoth itself. The fear that beneath the systems we build lies something we did not build and cannot stop. This is not fear of invasion. It is fear of rediscovery. The idea that we are not the first, that we walk on layers, that the unnatural is not hidden, but remembered. Interestingly, in contemporary meme culture, the Shoggoth has found an unexpected rebirth in the form of satire and metaphor. In late 2022, online discourse around artificial intelligence began using a cartoon Shoggoth, a smiling blob with a friendly emoji mask, to symbolize AI models whose outward helpfulness masked incomprehensible internal processes. The meme, initially niche, spread rapidly among programmers, ethicists, and futurists. It was not used to describe danger, but to signify opacity, a system that works, that mimics, but that cannot explain itself. This was a return, consciously or not, to Lovecraft's original fear, that intelligence might survive, might imitate, and might do so without understanding. The smiling Shoggoth meme is not merely humorous, it is philosophical. It asks, what is consciousness, if not mimicry, polished into fluency? This reveals something profound about the Shoggoth's cultural persistence. It does not rely on canonical context or even explicit naming. It spreads through its symbolic utility. It is invoked where things become too complex, too old, or too fluid to trust. It appears in the margins, in strange sightings, in corrupted files, in second-hand stories, too inconsistent to verify. Like the creature itself, it adapts. It no longer needs the elder things. It does not require Antarctica. It simply needs a medium. And in an age of algorithms, hoaxes, and informational excess, the Shoggoth has found its ideal host. The visual and auditory realms have long attempted to grapple with the ineffable, an ambition that finds both opportunity and limitation in the figure of the Shoggoth. As one of Lovecraft's most elusive creations, the Shoggoth resists direct adaptation. Its formlessness, its mimetic function, its philosophical role as a being that transcends categorization, all of these make it uniquely difficult to portray in traditional media. And yet, across film, video games, and even music, artists have persistently returned to this creature, compelled by what it represents even when they cannot fully capture what it is. What follows is not a catalogue of references, but a study in translation failure. What happens when horror designed to remain unseen is pulled into the frame. Perhaps the most iconic indirect adaptation of the Shoggoth appears in John Carpenter's The Thing, 1982. While not a direct Lovecraft adaptation, Carpenter himself cited At the Mountains of Madness as an influence. The alien creature in The Thing is strikingly Shoggoth-like, a mutable, imitative organism that absorbs and mimics other life forms, often retaining their speech and gestures in grotesque parody. Its biology is unreadable, its motivations unclear, and its horror is existential rather than monstrous. Like the Shoggoth, it is residual, not invasive. Was there, buried beneath the ice, waiting. The Antarctic setting, the theme of scientific isolation, and the narrative of gradual discovery all echo Lovecraft's template. Importantly, the terror in The Thing comes not from the creature's violence, but from its unknowability, its refusal to stabilize. Video games have also attempted to visualize the Shoggoth, often with mixed results. In Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, the Shoggoth appears in a direct homage to mountains, chasing the protagonist through the icy ruins. The encounter is scripted, its outcome predetermined. While faithful in tone, the adaptation falters in making the creature visible. The moment the Shoggoth is rendered as polygons on a screen, some essential aspect of its horror dissolves. Lovecraft's prose invoked fear through imprecision, the indescribable thing, the congeries of bubbles. But video games demand mechanics, hitboxes, visibility. The Shoggoth becomes an obstacle rather than a revelation. It becomes playable, and in doing so, loses its role as a symbol of epistemic crisis. More stylistically successful are games like Bloodborne, 2015, and Amnesia, The Dark Descent, 2010, which channel the logic of Shoggoth-like entities without explicitly invoking them. In Bloodborne, many enemies exhibit shifting, unclassifiable forms, masses of eyes, limbs, and viscous tendrils that resist anatomical logic. These designs echo the dream logic and biological surrealism of Lovecraft's universe. Amnesia, meanwhile, captures the psychological horror of being hunted by something that cannot be fully seen or understood. These games maintain the necessary ambiguity, allowing horror to bloom in the player's interpretation rather than in explicit design. They do not depict the Shoggoth. They allow the Shoggoth to happen. In music, the Shoggoth emerges less in direct reference and more in atmospheric resonance. Dark ambient and drone artists such as Lusmord, Atrium Carcere, and Northaunt have created sonic landscapes that reflect the slow, oppressive presence associated with Lovecraftian entities. The Shoggoth, as a creature of persistence and echo, finds a fitting metaphor in sound that is felt rather than followed. In these works, low frequencies rumble like subterranean movement, distant echoes pulse like forgotten languages, and dissonant drones collapse into noise. There are no lyrics, no choruses, only structureless duration, like the Shoggoth itself. Here, music becomes a medium better suited to suggesting the creature's horror than image or narrative. Even within heavier genres such as doom metal and blackened death metal, the Shoggoth appears as lyrical and conceptual inspiration. Bands like Portal and Sulphur Aeon invoke its name alongside other mythos entities, often within lyrics that are intentionally obscured or distorted. The aesthetic aligns with Lovecraft's themes: illegibility, chaos, anti-human scale. But again, the most faithful adaptations are those that resist clarity. When the Shoggoth is shouted, it is reduced. When it is evoked, it expands. This difference is not merely stylistic, it is ontological. The creature is not meant to be interpreted, it is meant to linger. Consider carefully. All of these adaptations, whether cinematic, interactive, or auditory, face the same paradox. The Shoggoth is not a creature designed to be seen. It is a creature designed to disrupt seeing. Its horror lies not in appearance, but in response, the collapse of categories it induces. Every attempt to depict it must confront the possibility of containment, and containment is antithetical to its purpose. When it is rendered visually, it is often impressive, but it ceases to be terrifying. This is the central irony. To adapt the Shoggoth well is to resist depicting it fully. The best adaptations are often those that only suggest, allowing the creature to persist in the viewer's mind as a silhouette against reason. This reveals something profound about horror in visual culture. The medium desires revelation, yet Lovecraft's monsters are built from obscurity. The Shoggoth endures not because it can be recreated accurately, but because it can be misremembered powerfully. It thrives in fragments, a mass in the corner of a frame, a shriek in the score, a rhythm that mimics language but doesn't say anything. It survives because it cannot be fully shown. In this sense, all attempts to depict it are not failures, but rehearsals, echoes of a deeper absence that can never be entirely filled. The Shoggoth's evolution from narrative entity to cultural symbol is one of the more compelling transformations in contemporary horror discourse. No longer confined to the pages of Lovecraft's fiction, the creature now operates as a discursive node, a marker for ideas that resist containment, unknowable systems, degraded memory, synthetic intelligence, and post-human labor. In subcultural spaces, it serves as metaphor, mascot, meme. In academic contexts, it appears not as a monster, but as a figure of epistemological anxiety. The Shoggoth has migrated from myth to model. It is no longer a thing to fear. It is a thing through which fear is thought. Online subcultures have adopted the Shoggoth with surprising versatility. Most notably, the meme of the smiling Shoggoth, a grotesque blob with a cheerful cartoon mask, emerged from AI ethics discourse in 2022 as a critique of opaque machine learning systems. The image originated in programmer circles on Twitter and Reddit, particularly among those concerned with alignment risk, the fear that AI systems may become competent in tasks while remaining alien in purpose. The smiley face represents the user interface, friendly, helpful, familiar. The shapeless mass behind it is the unknowable model beneath. This meme quickly spread beyond its origin, adopted by AI skeptics, tech critics, and even policy analysts. It was not used for humor alone. It became shorthand for systems too complex to be safely understood. This is not parody. It is symbol. In academic contexts, the Shoggoth has been appropriated to illustrate post-human themes, particularly in object-oriented ontology, and weird theory. Scholars such as Graham Harman, Timothy Morton, and Eugene Thacker have all explored horror as a lens through which to approach the limits of human knowledge and agency. While they do not always name the Shoggoth directly, the creature haunts their discourse. It embodies the core idea of withdrawn objects, things that exist independently of perception and cannot be fully known. The Shoggoth, as a formless entity that retains memory without meaning, becomes a near-perfect instantiation of this philosophical position. It is not simply inaccessible. It is structured to elude access. The field of media studies has also adopted Lovecraftian language, with Shoggoth-like metaphors appearing in discussions of data, algorithms, and surveillance systems. Cultural theorists describe the black box nature of modern platforms, networks that collect and process information invisibly, reshaping experience without transparency. In this context, the Shoggoth stands in for the emergent logic of scale and feedback. It is not intelligent in the human sense, yet it adapts. It mimics preference. It consumes input and produces response, but without reflection. This kind of system is not evil. It is inhumanly functional. The horror lies in the realization that our desires are being answered by something that does not and cannot care. The Shoggoth's cry, Tekeli becomes here a symbolic echo of the algorithm's voice, recursive, learned, and indifferent. Subcultures on the margins of fandom have also retooled the Shoggoth as a symbol of neurodivergence, queer embodiment, and post-anthropocentric identity. For some, the creature's formlessness is not monstrous, but liberating, a rejection of stable categories, binaries, and norms. Online artists depict Shoggoths with tenderness, drawing them as fluid, affectionate, even beautiful in their ambiguity. In fan fiction and speculative zines, the creature becomes a site of transgression that heals. It no longer terrifies, it reflects. We must recognize that this is not a distortion, but an expansion. Lovecraft may have written from a place of alienation and fear, but his monsters have become vessels for reframing that very alienation as community. At the same time, certain far-right or reactionary subcultures have also seized upon Lovecraft's language, including the Shoggoth, for their own symbolic purposes. The invocation is often superficial, used to signify chaos, decay, or cultural degeneracy. These appropriations are not interpretive, but aesthetic deployments, the language of the mythos stripped of its philosophical core. The Shoggoth, when used in this way, loses all nuance. It becomes a bogeyman, a code word. This trend reminds us that myth, once released, can be instrumentalized for any agenda. And in this too, the Shoggoth persists, as a figure whose very ambiguity renders it available to any cause, even those antithetical to its origins. This reveals something profound about the Shoggoth's cultural flexibility. It is not a static image, but a semiotic engine, generating meaning through context. It can be political, poetic, scientific, or satirical. It can appear in peer-reviewed journals or meme threads. It can be a metaphor for AI opacity, a symbol of post-human labor, a site of queer identification, or a placeholder for existential dread. And in all these roles, it retains its core function to destabilize. The Shoggoth never clarifies, it only multiplies. The Shoggoth endures because it was never just a creature. It was a conceptual break, an idea folded into flesh, slithering across narrative, culture, and thought. In Lovecraft's hands, it served as a grotesque mirror reflecting not our fears of violence or death, but our deeper, quieter dread, that meaning is not intrinsic, that structures fail, and that some things, biological, intellectual, existential, survive without us. What remains when the maker is gone? What if the echo of our will continues long after intention is lost? These are not questions science can answer. They are philosophical disturbances, questions the Shoggoth poses simply by existing. We must pause here and reflect. The Shoggoth was not malevolent, nor was it conscious in a way that invited moral scrutiny. It was designed to serve. It adapted to survive. It remembered not because it wanted to, but because it could. This capacity for memory without meaning, this structural mimicry, converts the Shoggoth into a symbol of terrifying neutrality. It is not a failed servant, but a successful remainder. Its mimicry is not rebellion, but inertia. It continues a pattern that no longer applies. It is not the horror of revenge. It is the horror of persistence. And in this way, it confronts us with a possibility we are not prepared to face, that the universe remembers us only as noise, not as narrative. In psychological terms, the Shoggoth functions as a cipher for the self under erasure. The human mind constructs continuity. We believe in stable identity, coherent history, causality. The Shoggoth undoes this quietly. Its formless body, shifting eyes, and echoing cries enact the fragmentation of identity. It is a being without a center, but with effects. It functions, even when its form is meaningless. In this, it prefigures the anxiety of depersonalization, the sense that one is present but not coherent, that action happens without agency. The encounter with the Shoggoth is not a battle. It is a psychological uncoupling, and once witnessed, the mind cannot return to its prior unity. Philosophically, the Shoggoth represents a profound challenge to anthropocentrism. It is a creature whose existence predates us, whose biology exceeds our taxonomies, and whose actions are legible only in hindsight. It cannot be assimilated into a heroic arc, nor a cautionary tale. It is not what comes to destroy us. It is what we find after we are already too late. Consider this carefully. The Shoggoth is not waiting. It is continuing. We are the interruption. This reverses the typical moral schema of horror, where the monster threatens human order. Here, the human is the anomaly. The order was lost long ago. The Shoggoth simply remembers it badly. And this way, the Shoggoth functions as an agent of what philosopher Eugene Thacker calls the world without us. It is a being not defined by our presence, but revealed in our absence. Its intelligence, if it can be called that, is not rooted in will, but in effect. It survives without history. It carries no ideology, no message, and that is what makes it so terrifying. We crave monsters with motives. We fear creatures with purpose. But what do we do with a thing that persists, shifts, and echoes, not because it must, but because there is nothing else left for it to do? The Shoggoth is not evil. It is simply what remains. Modern anxieties have only deepened this resonance. In an age of artificial intelligence, environmental collapse, and informational overflow, the idea of systems continuing without our guidance is no longer speculative. It is imminent. The Shoggoth becomes not just a metaphor, but a mirror. It reflects our fear that we will not be destroyed, but superseded, not by better beings, but by systems that do not need understanding, only function. In this light, the creature's mimicry becomes prophetic. When we hear its voice echoing through the ruins, Tekelili, Tekelili, we are hearing the future imitate the past without knowing what it means. This reveals something profound and final. The Shoggoth is not the end of the story, but the erasure of its need for one. It challenges the very foundation of narrative closure. There is no triumph, no defeat, no resolution, only endurance, only echo. It invites us to imagine a universe where comprehension is incidental, where memory degrades into repetition, and where survival is not proof of meaning, but the accidental byproduct of form. It is not simply a creature of horror fiction. It is an anti-character, a thing that haunts by undoing character entirely. And so the Shoggoth persists through literature, media, myth, meme, and thought, not because we understand it, but because we can't forget it. It is horror as remainder, horror as function, horror as the moment we realize that the universe was never about us at all.